Let us pray. O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight. You are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I remember a few months ago when I was standing in the new pizza place downtown just south of, not south, that would be, that's good. Just testing you. East of Wellington. Thanks, Eric. And I went in to get a pizza for Linda and I, and there was a lineup. I mean, like about 35 or 40 people in line, and the place was packed. And I thought to myself, there's lineups everywhere. Good places. Why could there not be a lineup here? What's preventing us from having a lineup here? I'll leave you to answer that question for yourself. I chose the cover on the bulletin intentionally because that was a book that I used to have on my shelf many years ago. Bill Eastham was part of the big church movement that come up and moved up out of the States into Canada. Sacred Cow, making gourmet burgers. Bit of a twist on the words there, right? But you can do something with a sacred cow. You can make something that's even much better to taste. However, and I was out on the West Coast when that book had come out. You see the subtext of it. Ministry anytime, any place, by anyone. That was then, and the church to this very day is still having a tough time allowing that to happen in their congregations. I know that as one who's in a leadership role. I can tell you stories about how that has been prevented from happening. Congregations will say they want anyone here, but when some of those anyones come in with an idea, incredible ideas, I have seen those ideas shut down just like that, as quick as a snap, because the common phrase is, we don't do things like that here. That's not who we are. Today we conclude the series on the emerging church. And in doing so, in part, we remember all of those who have gone before us and have laid the groundwork of what it means to be faith-filled people, and who helped to plant the story of God into our world, using many different methods to do so. Buildings, churches, church suppers, lunches, concerts, you can name them all. And there are even those who risked their very lives to speak a gospel into the world. But there's something else that resonated for me this week as we concluded the series on what is emerging in new ways of being church in the 21st century. It's now almost just over 3 years ago that we celebrated the Reformation. You know that thing when there was a new church? Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses on the church door. That radical piece of paper by that radical priest. That would be the beginning of something entirely new and different. Luther used the power of the press that day to get the message out, to communicate. Now that was just over 500 years ago. But as great religious writer and author Phyllis Tickle has said in the past, it seems that about every 500 years, historically speaking, the church decides to hold a giant rummage sale. In other words, something new something new is going to emerge. Now, 500 years, interestingly enough, before Luther was the Great Schism of 1051. And 500 years before that was the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And on and on and on through history you can see these markers. Perhaps you and I find ourselves in that time where another major reformation is happening. And there's lots of people in our time who don't like it. Another resurrection is taking place. Some things will die, and there will be new life, resurrection, taking place everywhere we turn. New ways of being church are happening in our world everywhere, in ways you would have a difficult time understanding, because it's not part of your experience. It never has been. Our reading this morning, I love this reading for all kinds of reasons. First off, there's a lot of people who are complaining in that reading. They're in misery, they're frightened in fear because they're in the wilderness, and they're screaming out at their leader, "Why did you take us away from Pharaoh?" We would rather live with the misery of Pharaoh than be in a place that we don't know and we don't know where we're going. That's the story. The focus was squarely on Yahweh. And when the grumbling and the terrified Israelites find themselves trapped between the forces of Pharaoh and the angry waves of the sea in that reading, they scream, "Moses," that their freedom has turned into imminent death. "Plenty of graves in Egypt, Moses," they shout. "Why bring us into this God-forsaken place where death is even more certain and even more horrendous?" I hear those stories in the 21st century. Moses' response makes the central point of this resurrection tale. Do not be afraid. Stand still and see that the Holy One will work for you today. And with that grand oration in the Israelites' ears, Moses stretches out his hand over the sea, and now two separate and distinct events occur. We, of course, are most familiar with the walls of water on the right and on the left, made indelible in our minds by that Cecil B. DeMille epic of over 6 decades ago, done incidentally, in case you didn't know, by using Jell-O, resisting the water in that picture. And it was the only Oscar that particular film won. But that is only one of the stories told in this complex account, because there is another one. Yahweh drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land. Now here we witness some sort of long tidal event rather than some instantaneous piling up of divided water walls. An event as magical and as grand as this can hardly be confined to any one telling of it. There are two accounts of creation. And most famously today, there are 4 different tellings of the resurrection of Jesus. Again, you and I are not asked to choose the right story. Is the title account more believable, hence more possibly historical than the walls of water story? This is, again, I suggest to you, not the point. Both stories have Yahweh at the center. Both stories announce that Yahweh is the God of life, ever active against the forces of death. This ancient resurrection story mirrors and echoes all other stories of dying and rising gods from the ancient Near East. It is not more or less historical than they, Its power is not found in its historical plausibility. It has power because it is my story. It is the story that I choose, the story that has lured me into its potent orbit, the story that affirms my conviction that there is something greater than myself that is seeking and creating life every day in a world too often. And it always overcomes death. Being open to the Spirit. A lot of Protestants aren't friendly to that word, Spirit, because we can't contain that word in Greek pneuma. Being open to the Spirit of the Holy One. Will the Spirit help you and I discern and trust how we are prepared to risk it all for the sake of God? It's like being on, at least for me, it's like being on a wonderful playground I find myself in. We find ourselves in. With the freedom, the absolute freedom to create something new and fresh. Many of you will remember the line in the United Church, fresh expressions, partnerships in fresh expressions of the church. So now I'm going to share with you some of the details about emerging churches. Some of the ways it's happened, some of the ways it is now happening, so you have insights as to what's going on outside of these two different buildings on opposite sides of each other. Very, very different church. Just a heads up, and I may have said this before, but as IBM taught me many years ago, you have to repeat a message 7 times before people finally get it. I'm not going to preach 7 times the same sermon. Millennials, don't ever use the word committee with most millennials. Don't actually use it with me, because I'll run the other way. In their workplaces, they use the term team. And so people have already heard me around both congregations. I'll talk about the transition team. The reason team is a better term is there's a psychology to the word team that there is not with the word committees. So I'm just giving you a heads up on that, in case you invite any millennials to join you. They like projects. A lot of them like short-term projects. If you want to ask them to do something, they'll say, okay, tell me what it's about. How often will we meet? Can we meet over our computers and Skype each other? And what's the window of time the project is for? I can do something and commit to something maybe for 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and that's it for me. Now, in their workplaces, it's different because the boss tells them what they have to do, right? So, governance models in churches. I went back to a church that had an official board. And honest to God, the last time I experienced an official board was in 1985 when I was ordained. And then ever since 1986 or 87, I'd never experienced another official board in my life. It was council. I did go to a church, and I'm going to share that with you, Eden United Church, that I went to from here, Sydenham Street United. When I arrived there, they had an official board. They considered themselves to be a progressive church. And you know who showed up at the official board meetings? The chair people of the various committees. That's it. But they still believed it was important to have an official board. And my comment to them after 3 years was, is this working for you? Because I don't see it is. It's not working. So, here's some details about emerging churches. At Eden, and I can't tell you the whole story because it's too long, but it will be a highlight in my ministry for sure. At Eden United Church, with a team of people, we blew up I'm going to be quite profound. We blew up the entire organizational structure of that church. What that meant, now that was with the congregation's permission, by the way. It took us 2.5 years to do this presentation. We got rid of every single committee in the church. I made sure with general counsel to confirm what we could do and we couldn't do, and we were alerted that which made sense, the only two things that we couldn't touch were the HR department, which is ministry and personnel, and the trustees. That's it. Everything else was collapsed. People were basically fired in a polite way. All right? And we then moved into a governance model called the Carver Policy Governance Model. Now, that's not for all churches, and it's not for all communities. Forget churches. Interestingly enough, I discovered a few years after that there were conferences, some conferences, who had moved into that style of governance, and that's the way they were operating. What we formed were lots of teams of people. And people said to me, and they were fair questions, well, Barry, what will happen with communion? Who's going to do communion? I said, that's a good question. I said, maybe nobody's going to do communion. Well, that can't happen, they said. And I said, well, if there's nobody doing communion, then communion's not going to happen. And maybe if no communion is going to happen, maybe what that's saying is that communion is not as important as you once thought it was. And that's the way it was with everything. But I can tell you that within 2 weeks, there were all kinds of things after the congregation, and they gave a 99% approval. There were over 300 people at this congregational meeting for this model, or this playground, because the way it was introduced is you can have status quo, or you can go into this and try it out for 2 years and see how it works. And if it doesn't work, you can tweak it. You can talk to me about that if you want to know more about that. I can fill you in on that. Spiritual gifts inventory. When we fired the Council of Eden United Church, and we had to fire them because it was collapsed, right? We had to get 13 people. Formed a nominating team. We had 45 names we put together. We approached the 45 people. We sent a package out to them that we put together with a spiritual gift inventory inside it, a short form notes on how the Carver Policy Governance Model works, and a variety of other things. Told them to get back to us and let us know if they wanted to continue the journey. Eventually what happened, it went from 45 down to 33, down to 28 people for different reasons. Some people had to decide to change their minds because their jobs were changing. And then we were down to 19 people for 13 positions. Now, I don't know about anybody here, but I've never been in any church or congregation in my entire ministry where I've had more people wanting to serve in any positions on any committee. It just has never happened. I had the rich privilege in sitting in a congregational meeting where each of those 19 persons had 3 minutes to stand and give a speech as to why they felt that they wanted to be a part of this new governing model and what they had to offer. And 6 of them lost the vote. And the one woman whose sister lives way up in northern Ontario phoned her that afternoon and said, so, are you on the new council? And she said, no, I lost. And her sister said, how do you lose sitting on a committee in the United Church of Canada? That was a profound moment for me in the ministry of that church, to sit and listen to people make a commitment to something that was so deep in their soul. Context and relationships are important for us. Now, at Roncesvalles United Church in the west side of Toronto, I journeyed over there. This is long before I came down here. I was going around to different churches. They took their CE wing of their building because Roncesvalles was going to close, and they got into a big fight with Presbytery because Presbytery wasn't going to let them do something, and they won that fight. It was a good fight to be able to do whatever they wanted to do in some ways. So when you go into Roncesvalles United Church, the whole 3-story side of their Christian education building, The main level is all yoga going on and yoga worship on Sunday mornings. If you don't know what yoga worship is, look it up. It's still worship. It's just expressed through a different medium. On the top floor, they literally gutted the whole top floor, and they made 20 different offices. Small offices, and those offices are rented out to members of the Roncesvalles community, because the Roncesvalles community is a high-need community in many ways. And so on that floor, you have psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists, rehab people, social workers, nurses, everything. And they're all renting out spaces so that people can come into that building and be seen by different people for different reasons. That's a part of Roncesvalles ministry into the community. That's church in a radically different way. I can't tell you the whole story about Roncesvalles. Go on to their website and you'll find out more, a lot more about how they've transformed themselves. I would challenge you to go to the Google site for Hillhurst United Church in Calgary that I'm very familiar with, and John Pentland is in ministry there. A model of ministry that is highly successful, and they in fact have people standing in lines some Sundays to get into church. They're doing a lot right because of the context they find themselves in. Faith United in Milton is an outreach ministry church. They will not hire a minister. They don't want to have a budget item that says we are paying a clergy person. And so they have ministers who come in, and I've been there different times and preached on Sundays for them, but sometimes they listen to a TED message, but their ministry to Milton as a church, and they are recognized as a church by the United Church of Canada. It took about 5 years for that to almost happen. They are an outreach ministry church. That's a new emerging church that the United Church of Canada initially had no idea what they were going to do with. It was a breakaway group of people who wanted to form something. And they don't meet in a building like this. They meet in a hall to do their ministry. At Kingston Road, where I left, my final detail, because it took us 3 years to move them to a place into new mission with new vision. I encourage someone to offer a mindfulness meditation program. On Monday nights, the decision was made to do that. The rationale for doing that was because the understanding was from the wider community outside of the congregation what they wanted. And the first thing they declared is they wanted meditation. We weren't concerned as a church as to whether these people would attend worship on Sunday morning. That would be nice if they showed up. It was more about what we understand the ministry to the community was about. And I can tell you today, and this is what I've learned since I've arrived here through the person I encouraged to do it. They've just received a $10,000 grant to continue launching another program to do with the mindfulness meditation as it relates to seniors, because there was a need in the community for this ministry to happen specifically in an orientated way with senior citizens. And the senior citizens in that area were requesting it. That's a ministry that I had the good fortune of saying to the person that came to me with the idea, where I was able to say, it's a great idea, write it on a piece of paper, what's it all about, how's it going to go, when are you going to meet, what do you need any money? And then I said, God bless you, go and do it. They did not have to go through 50 committees before a decision was made to give that person permission to do that. In other words, they were excited about something and it launched. They started an employment program which happens twice a year because it's there's an outreach lunch that happens in 5 different churches in that area of the beaches. Every day, somebody can go for a hot meal at lunchtime at the different churches. At Kingston Road, it would be on Fridays. The decision suddenly was, out of the part of the new mission, was to make sure in that element of the life of the church, there would be an opportunity to train somebody in food services to run the program for 6 weeks. And they had to go through all the hoops with the city and all of that kind of stuff. And that's now been up and running, and it's happening. And those people that are getting hired are people who are the down and outers in the area of that church, who were the one person I've just found out is one of the people who was coming there every day to get a hot meal. Now, when they finish that 6 weeks, they have employable skills that they can go back out into the world with and feel better about themselves. That's a ministry of the church. I could tell you so much more, but that's for you to discover for yourselves. I find it's always valuable for me to read again and remind myself of this Israelite resurrection story, a story that has sustained Judaism now for well over 3 millennia, through horrific persecutions and hatred and rejection throughout the centuries. The history of the thing is beside the point. It is the story that counts, I believe, for us. And so for us Christians, we are not helped by demands to suspend any law of physics in order to accept the unacceptable and to believe the unbelievable. So I'm reminded again of one of my favorite rabbinic stories, and I will paraphrase it as it has been told and retold over many centuries. A famous rabbi told his best student, "You must keep the tradition alive, my son, by going to a certain place in the forest, lighting a special candle, singing the correct psalm, and telling the story." The old rabbi died, and his student became himself a famous rabbi. Unfortunately, though, he could no longer remember the exact forest spot that he was to go. So he told his student to light the candle, sing the psalm, and tell the story wherever he thought it was right. After that rabbi's death, his student had forgotten about the candle when he told his student about keeping the tradition alive, but urged him to sing the song and then tell the story. That rabbi died, and his student knew nothing of the forest spot or the candle and forgot about the song. He trained his student to tell the story. And it was enough. It is enough. The story of the Sea of Reeds and the story of the resurrection of Jesus are more than enough to change the way that we think about God or about church and how it may or may not happen, and the way that we think about living our days into the future. It's one of the ways that ministry anytime, any place, by anyone can and will happen. May it be so for you, and may it be so for me.